All right, it's time for police to accept that they've lost control of the streets. That's the word from the South African National Editors Forum chair, Sibusiso Ngalwa. He says this has been proven over and over again by events like the July riots, ongoing gang violence on the Cape Flats and persistent high crime rates. The SANEF chairperson joins us now to unpack this a bit further. Mr. Ngalwa, good morning and thank you very much for your time. So around this time last year, you had in fact urged government in an article to prioritise the socio-economic problems that had given rise to the lawlessness that we saw during those riots. It's 2022. Many could argue that not only does the problem still exist, but it has worsened. What is your view today as several organisations plan their shutdowns and community members are butchered, with very few being apprehended for those killings?
Good morning to you, Mfundo, and the viewers. I just want to make one correction first, is that the articles I write in my personal capacity as a journalist, not under the SANEF hat. But be that as it may, the reality is that soon after the July unrest last year, we saw the response of the government, which was actually woefully inadequate. And the fact that you've had 354 people dying and no one has been held accountable, that's what I had made in that article. And the fact that we're seeing lawlessness in this country. But what has happened is that when I read that article again, it's actually, those issues are still very much relevant. The fact that while government appointed a high-level panel to investigate that, we actually still have not had the president come out. What this year, in fact, this July, what we would have expected is that the president should have come out to say, in marking 1 year of the July unrest, we had the report by the expert panel, which made a number of recommendations, including the fact that government must look at making sure that they deal with the underlying socio-economic issues. And they highlighted the issue of youth unemployment, which is standing at over 70%. But more importantly was the fact that we actually have non-existent intelligence services, that there's still no one who's been held accountable for that. And that status remains even today. So what would have made sense at this point is that at least the president should give us an account to say that we appointed the expert panel. These were the recommendations. This is what we have done so far, and none of that has happened. And I think that actually is telling of the failure of the government to actually take seriously what happened last year, and also the fact that we may see a recurrence at some time.
So surely then, like you say, you concur with Business Unity South Africa that says South Africa is ripe for yet another installment of some sort of unrest or lawlessness in the country.
The reality is that we have not seen the government implement those recommendations. Yes, within the police, we now have a new commissioner. But what has happened in intelligence? In intelligence, what we saw was the president centralizing intelligence within the presidency and appointing a deputy minister. Well, some people have argued that that's how it's done the world over. But the reality is that there is nothing to demonstrate that our intelligence services have been stripped of political influence, or rather of political manipulation, that we now are on the mend, or actually we have an intelligence service that is working towards rebuilding its structures and being a credible intelligence service that serves the country and not the political party, the ANC. We have not seen none of that happening. What is currently happening in this country, even within the political parties and the ANC is currently engrossed and rather immersed in its political factional battles, as we are now building up towards the December conference. You would have seen on social media and other platforms that there are posters of marches that are coming and demonstrations. Those demonstrations have nothing to do with dealing with the underlying socio-economic issues that gave rise to some of these demonstrations and some of that violence, but rather they are about removing this one leader and replacing them with the other. And I think when people are saying that the conditions are ripe for another unrest or condition or another kind of civil unrest, the reality is that nothing can stop it, because we have not seen anything. We have not seen the police being capacitated to deal with what happened last year. And more importantly, before I hand it back to you, the reality is that the police and the government, remember, they did not stop the unrest. It was actually the public. It was South Africans who said, not in my area, not under my watch, this will not be happening. The government and the security services stood by and watched helplessly. And we still have not seen anything to remedy that, to say that this is what has been done. Hence, I'm saying that the president should, at the very least, have come out in this July to mark the 1 year of the unrest to say this is what happened, these were the recommendations by the panel, and this is what we have done so far.
But to their defense, we've had the SANDF come out with the police minister to say going forward they will act in concert. So meaning they will always assess the situation and know to bring in the SANDF much more quicker. So will that not help going forward?
Remember, the SANDF is about that's the army you're talking about. So you're talking about the brute force of the state, but there was more to that report in terms of what needed to be done. I mean, the issues that were raised is also the issue of racial prejudice that was prevalent in areas like Phoenix, and the fact that the government recommendation that government should do more to build social cohesion. We have been back there. Our newsrooms, your reporters have been on the ground in Phoenix. What is the community saying? That the community in Phoenix is saying, short of soccer matches and a few other activities, that's all that has been done by the government. There's nothing to show to say that there has been, one, redress, or two, an attempt to reconcile those communities, because those communities are still poles apart. And those tensions that were that surfaced last year are still very much there, with very little being done by the government to drive that process. And the reality is that with such a situation being allowed to fester, what we might see is that we might see more violence coming from there. But I think more worryingly is that 354 human beings died during that unrest, and not a single person has been held accountable. So to say that the police and the SANDF will join hands or will respond to situation is neither here nor there. The reality is, where is the justice in those cases that we've already seen?
No, a very pertinent question. Where is the justice? But when you speak of Phoenix, beyond the racial tensions there, we saw an over-reliance on private security. Are you concerned as a journalist that perhaps in this area where we're seeing a lot of people or some sort of a commodification of a basic right which is to be protected, that here we're going to see people who are safe and protected being those who are able to pay for their security and safety?
The rise of private security, the reality is that South Africans who can afford do not rely on the South African Police Service. And I'm sure you know yourself from your own experience that the reason why people these days report crimes is for insurance purposes, because there's no one who believes that if there's been a burglary at their house, that the police will actually be able to successfully prosecute that case. And there's a lot of crime that remains unreported. So those who can afford have no choice but to rely on private security, and the strength and the over-reliance on private security by families and by public in South Africa is actually another indication of the failure by the state, failure of state institutions, particularly the law enforcement. And you see now this is spread into other areas. You see insurance companies join hands with communities to fill up potholes, to help with traffic lights. That is not because those companies, yes, it's well and good, it's part of social responsibility, but also it's about protecting themselves, because they understand that with more potholes, there are more claims. So and the reality is that the state is not responding, the municipalities are not doing their job. So while now you have these state functions, basic state functions being taken over by private business, that is another telling sign of the danger of what we're seeing, in the fact that instead of coming back from the conditions that we saw a year ago, yes, we've had COVID-19 over the past 2 years, that notwithstanding, instead of coming back from the losses we have encountered, things are not seen to be improving. Rather, they are seen to be getting worse. And I don't think that government, or at the very least on the part of the president, he has done enough to demonstrate that he takes these issues seriously. One, through appointing competent ministers, or ministers that are showing signs of being able to resolve the same issues. We're sitting now for 2-3 weeks with rolling blackouts. We're now sitting with timers, because we now know, not timers rather, but reminders. So we now have to remember that at 8 o'clock, it's now stage 3. We must now know it's stage 5. That is our life. We've come to accept that. What do we get from government? We get ministers like the Minister of Public Enterprises telling us that this is about some not necessarily third force, but rather this is about some criminal elements and all of that, and or striking workers. That is not good enough. That is not good enough. The reality is that the government has failed without, even though we've seen had countless promises that they will be able to resolve the electricity crisis, among other crises in this country.
Mr. Ngalwa, thank you very much for your insights. A very sad state of affairs. That's Sibusiso Ngalwa, son of chairperson, but today he speaks in his capacity as a journalist. To this